Chapter I. The visitor at dawn. It was on a gray and wind-bitten morning in early November that I found myself once again at Baker Street, summoned by a terse but unmistakably urgent telegram from Holmes. The streets were slick with the remnants of a midnight rain, and the gas lamps still flickered dimly in the gloom as though reluctant to yield to the wan light of dawn. A passing hansom cab rattled by, its driver hunched in a threadbare coat, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell struck 6. It was at this hour that I mounted the familiar 17 steps and entered the sitting room I knew so well. Holmes was standing by the fire, his dressing gown wrapped loosely about him and his lean figure silhouetted against the flames. The pungent odor of strong coffee filled the room, mingling with the faint chemical temps that so often pervaded it in the early hours. Upon the table lay a curious assemblage of objects: a brass cog, no larger than a shilling, a length of fine black ribbon, and, most arresting of all, a small metallic sculpture of a raven with wings spread as though caught mid-flight. It's clockwork. Bodhi gleamed faintly in the half-light, and I could see a tiny key protruding from the base. "Ah, Watson," said Holmes, turning toward me with that peculiar glint in his eye which never failed to signal the onset of a case worthy of his faculties. "You are prompt, as always. I had feared that the fog might delay you." "I came at once," said I, unbuttoning my overcoat. "Your telegram had a certain economy of words that spoke volumes." He permitted himself the ghost of a smile. "Economy, my dear fellow, is the very essence of communication. You will observe," he added, pointing to the raven on the table, "that we are not to be idle this morning." I stepped closer, examining the object. "A toy, surely?" I ventured. "Though finely made." "Not a toy," he said, with quiet emphasis. "A herald." Before I could inquire further, there came the sound of footsteps upon the stairs, hurried, uneven, betraying a certain agitation. Mrs. Hodson knocked briefly before ushering in a man whose pallor and disheveled appearance marked him as one who had passed a sleepless night. He was of middle height, with graying hair at the temples and a thin mustache that quivered slightly as he took in the scene before him. In his gloved hands he clutched a sealed envelope, crumpled as though it had been opened and closed more than once. "This is Mr. Aldous Pennington," Mrs. Hudson announced, before retreating. The man inclined his head nervously. "Pray, be seated, Mr. Pennington," Holmes said with that precise courtesy he reserved for clients of evident distress. "The hour is early, but your visit is earlier still. It would appear that something of considerable urgency has driven you to Baker Street?" "You are quite right, Mr. Holmes," Pennington replied, lowering himself into the chair opposite. "I beg your pardon for the intrusion at such an hour, but I had no choice. Scotland Yard is quite at sea, and I have been told that only you might make sense of what has happened." Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "Pray, begin at the beginning. The clarity of a narrative is often the first step toward its solution." Pennington took a deep breath. 3 nights ago, at my residence in Belgravia Square, a most extraordinary event occurred. My housekeeper discovered, perched upon the mantel of my study, that very object. He gestured toward the clockwork raven. "None of my household claims to have seen anyone enter. The doors were locked, the windows bolted. Yet there it was, its wings spread, and the faint sound of ticking emanated from within. I glanced involuntarily at the raven. Though silent now, there was something uncanny in the precision of its construction. Its eyes were tiny lenses of polished obsidian, and the craftsmanship of its feathers rivaled that of a jeweler. Holmes leaned forward. "Go on," Within the hour of its discovery, Pennington continued, a messenger arrived at my door. He was a ragged boy, no more than 10, and he bore a letter addressed to me in an elegant, unfamiliar hand. This letter he produced. The crumpled envelope contained but a single line. When the raven sings, the truth shall break. There was no signature. Holmes took the letter with delicacy, examining the paper against the light, sniffing faintly at the edges, and running a long finger along the seal. No watermark, he murmured. The paper is of continental manufacture, French, I should judge, though not of the highest grade. The handwriting. There is a leftward slant inconsistent with native English penmanship. Curious. Proceed. 2 nights later, Pennington said, his voice dropping to a tremor, my coachman was found dead in the mews. There was a sharp intake of breath from me. Murdered? Strangled? Pennington whispered. The police believe it was a common thief. But nothing was taken, not his watch, nor his purse. And again, on the stable door. There was found another of these. He reached into his coat and drew out a second clockwork raven. Identical to the first, Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden intensity. And the mechanism? Have you wound it? I have not dared. Quite right. One should never wind an enigma until one is prepared for its song, Holmes said cryptically. He rose and began pacing the room, the tails of his dressing gown flaring slightly as he moved. A locked room delivery, an anonymous letter in continental script, and a murder accompanied by a mechanical emblem. Tell me, Mr. Pennington, have you any enemies of note? Political, financial, or dare I say, romantic? Pennington hesitated. None that I am aware of. I am a retired barrister. My affairs are modest. My late wife passed away some years ago, and I live alone too. Save for my servants. Holmes paused mid-stride, his profile outlined sharply against the fire. A retired barrister, he mused. Then you will have left your mark upon many a man's liberty. Pennington swallowed. Naturally, I prosecuted in my day, but that was years ago. Surely retribution is often patient, Holmes. Interrupted. Then, more briskly, Watson, you will accompany me to Belgravia within the hour. Mr. Pennington, return home and admit no strangers. Should any new raven appear, do not touch it. Send a word at once. Pennington rose, relief and fear mingling in his expression. I am in your hands, Mr. Holmes. God help me. After he had gone, I turned to Holmes. What do you make of it? He gave me a thin smile. My dear Watson, what do you make of it? I frowned, marshalling the facts. An anonymous threat, perhaps? Someone with access to his house? The raven might be symbolic death, omens? That sort of thing. But the coachman's death, it seems more than coincidence. Holmes nodded approvingly. You have the bones, though not yet the flesh. This is no common mischief. There is a mind behind this, Watson, a mind with both precision and imagination. Do you note the phrase in the letter? When the raven sings. That implies future action, a mechanism yet to be set in motion. And mark this. The delivery of the raven in a locked house bespeaks a trespasser of uncommon ingenuity. We shall see Belgravia in daylight, though I doubt the light will make matters less obscure. He wound his watch and snapped it shut. A hansom in 30 minutes. Dress warmly. The fog is thickening. As I prepared to leave, I glanced once more at the silent raven upon the table. Its key protruded like a taunt, daring one to turn it. I felt, in that moment, an inexplicable shiver, as though some invisible clock had begun to count down the ebb. Hours to a revelation we could not yet fathom. Holmes, sensing my gaze, spoke softly. "It is not the bird that troubles me, Watson, but the hand that set it flying." And so began the singular case which the newspapers later termed the affair of the Clockwork Raven, a case that drew us through the fog-shrouded streets of London into a web of cunning so intricate that even Holmes himself, for a time, walked its strands in darkness. Chapter 2. The Brass Cog and the Locked Room. It has often struck me, in looking back upon those singular adventures which I have been privileged to chronicle, that we did not so much set forth to meet strange events as find them moving choir, as smoke toward us. So it was upon that November morning when, having fortified ourselves with coffee and toast, Holmes and I descended to Baker Street, where a hansom cab, summoned by his note to the yard porter, waited with a steaming horse, and an impatient jingle of traceys. The fog, which had lain low and sullen at daybreak, was now uncoiling itself in slow skeins among the housetops, and the lamps along the thoroughfare burned with the sickly glare of fish-eyes in a net. Holmes sprang in with his habitual agility, and flicked a glance at the driver. "Belgravia Square, new. Does it set ye?" The man touched his whip. "Right you are, sir." We had not gone a dozen yards before my friend leaned forward and tapped the inside panel with the ferrule of his cane. Our cabman took his first fare of the morning near the Marylebone goods yard. He observed, a man who had slept little and drank less, and who left in some haste when he heard a shunting whistle. I smiled at the audacity. "Come, Holmes. This is scarcely fair upon the unfortunate fellow's privacy." "Privacy?" Holmes's eyes danced. "I speak of his cushion, my dear Watson. Observe these black crumbs along the right-hand seam, coal dust, sharply edged and unmingled with city grime, which indicates it came direct from the goods yard, and not by scatter from a passing wagon. His reins carry the faint, sour tang of wet. Leather an early start before the sun could draw the damp. As for the first fare's sobriety, the absence of cigar ash or spirits effluvium upon the lap-robe is conclusive." The man had been waiting. "See how the frosting upon the window has been rubbed in a small circle at left height? One rub, a repeated act, generally signifies nervous impatience. You see every trifling impression as though it were written." "In a large hand," said I, half admiring, half amused. "Trifles are the alphabet of crime," he returned, settling back. "One learns to read them, or one is consigned to the babble of superstition." The cab rattled southward, across Oxford Street and past the languid sweep of Hyde Park, where the fog lay in soft drifts like unspun wool against the iron palings. Presently we entered that quarter of polished stone and discreet fortune which is Belgravia. Its squares broad, its windows telling silently of money and of those who make it speak. At No. 17, a butler with frosted side whiskers and a face of proper concern admitted us with a bow that would have done credit to a state occasion. "Mr. Pennington is within. Gentlemen, Inspector Lestrade has also called." "Excellent," Holmes murmured. Misapprehension at the earliest stage of a case is an advantage to the man who sees. We were ushered into a spacious hall and thence to a study upon the ground floor, a grave, well-appointed room of law books, a turkey carpet, a heavy mahogany desk, and, upon the mantel, an alabaster clock whose gilded cupid looked down with a simper entirely out of place. It was to this mantel that my eye went at once, for there, in the center, stood the metallic bird we had seen at Baker Street. It gleamed with a subdued menace in the half-light, its tiny wings outspread, the winding key in its base like a sting. Lestrade, neat as a pin and alert as a terrier, turned from the window with a nod. "Good morning, Mr. Holmes." Doctor, I was just remarking to Mr. Pennington that the matter seems plain enough. Indeed. Holmes's tone was courteous, his face expressionless. House. Full of servants, said Lestrade briskly. A mechanical contraption placed where it would cause alarm. A threatening letter. The coachman strangled the next night in the mews. Your man is inside the house. When a thing happens in a locked place, it is because those with the keys have done it. Holmes regarded him as the naturalist contemplating a beetle of known species. And the second raven in the stable? How do you reconcile that with larceny or resentful mischief? Lestrade shrugged. Hoodoo, theatricals. 2 overall. To put suspicion elsewhere, I shall have the housekeeper and groom in custody before the day is out. Let us hope you do not deprive Mr. Pennington of his dinner service as well, said Holmes dryly. Watson, pray, note the door. I had already observed that the oak door opened upon the hall and bore a fresh scratch upon the shining brass of its escutcheon. Holmes bent his head, took out his lens, and examined the mark with delicate absorption. Not a key? He murmured. A blade narrow, triangular in section? Few observed the minute burrs raised along the scratch. Our interloper, or one who sought to imitate him, employed an instrument more often seen in the hand of a jeweler than a housebreaker. He crossed to the windows next. These were tall casements looking out upon the square, their lower sections secured by brass fastenings and a key, which the butler Kersey, he announced himself, assured us, was never removed from the drawer. The sashes were tight. A faint line of grease showed they had been opened recently and reclosed. Yet there was dust upon the sill so evenly laid that no footprint, no smudge, had disturbed it. The dust is domestic, Holmes observed, touching it, not street dust. Mrs. Blount, sir, said a dignified woman with capable hands and eyes red from lack of sleep. Keeper, you dust daily, Mrs. Blount, but I see that yesterday afternoon you neglected this sill. Her eyes widened. Indeed, sir, I did forget it. What, with the police coming and going, which shows, Holmes continued, that if a man had passed by this window, he would have left a trace upon a surface that had been left for him. To Margie did not. Therefore, he turned. The lens flashing, the room was entered and the raven placed without the use of these casements. Which leaves the door, Lestrade snapped. As I said, there is also the chimney, said Holmes evenly. We all glanced at the chimney piece, where a fire burned with the dull glow of good coal and little flame. Holmes went to one knee, drew the fender aside, and, with the tongs, teased forth a small, blackened object from among the embers. He placed it upon the hearthstone and regarded it with satisfaction. It was a sliver of metal, no larger than the half of my smallest fingernail, toothed along one edge and with a spot of red-brown still adhering. A fragment of a cog, said I, recalling the bit of brass upon our breakfast table. Just so, Watson. And the red-brown is not rust, but a varnish used upon fine clockwork to moderate friction. A curious thing to find among the ashes of Mr. Pennington's respectable fire. Pennington, who had been standing by with the strained air of one who listens for a verdict he cannot influence, made a startled movement. You mean someone attempted to burn such a thing in my heart? Or it fell from a mechanism placed upon the mantel, Holmes replied. A bird, for instance. He rose and now applied his lens to the alabaster clock. Do you perceive? This smear, Watson, just at the Cupid's wing. And here, this faint, crescent-shaped indentation on the mantel's polish. They are recent within 3 days, and they lie at a height which corresponds not to a human hand, but to an object. Set down with care from above. Above note this picture hook, empty, and the nail with a powdery film upon its head. "Mrs. Blount, what hung here?" "A small portrait of my late mistress, sir," said the housekeeper softly. "Mrs. Pennington, in the black frame." "And when was it last moved?" "Not for months, sir. Only when I discovered the mechanical bird upon the mantel that morning. The portrait was crooked." Holmes's thin lips compressed. "Crooked, indeed. Kersey, fetch a chair." He mounted lightly and brought his face close to the cornice. A moment later he extended a gloved finger and plucked free a single fiber, which he transferred, with the delicacy of an entomologist, to his card case. "What is it?" I asked. "A hare," he said, "but not human, and not from any common domestic beast. File that under later." Lestrade gave a small, impatient cough. "While Mr. Holmes collects hairs from the ceiling, I shall do something practical. Mr. Pennington, your coachman found dead in the mews the following night," Holmes finished, his voice taking on that chilled timbre I had learned to associate with the discovery of some inward pattern. "Stranglite, his effects undisturbed, and on the stable door another raven." "We have it at the yard," said Lestrade. "If the thing will sing, we shall make it sing there, where it can do no harm." Holmes turned his gaze upon the bird. "On the mantel? Has anyone wound this?" "No, sir," Mrs. Blount answered quickly. "We have not touched it, nor should you. Watson, do you smell it?" I bent, and at first detected only the faint mineral breath of metal and oil. Then there came to me so elusive, I doubted my senses, a whisper of some scent more delicate, like a ghost of an orange blossoming behind shutters. "A perfume," I said. "Citrus, no, bergamot, with a bitter edge." "Clock oil scented to avoid the rank smell of the machine," Holmes said. "A vanity in a craftsman or a mark of a particular shop. I have encountered such a thing once before." "In London?" I asked. "In Paris," he returned, and would say no more. But the gleam in his eye was the flash one sees when a sword is tested along a thumb edge. He moved about the room now with the fencer's light step, pausing here and there to touch, to measure with that mental rule which seldom failed him. He knelt to examine the skirting board beneath the window, and his fingernail brought away a minute grit of something blue that glinted when it caught the light. "Prussian blue," he murmured, "bound with wax. A smear, not a stroke." He looked at the bell pull, a braided cord that ran down the wall to a brass mouth upon the wainscot. "Interesting." "May I ask?" Pennington began, his voice strained. "You may always ask," said Holmes, a shade absently. "Answers are another matter. Tell me, Mr. Pennington, did your late wife keep a music box?" "A music box?" "Why, yes, she had. One from Geneva, with little birds that sprang up when the lid was lifted. But it has not been wound since her death." "Why do you?" Holmes's glance had shifted to a small cabinet upon the sideboard, where lay a scatter of pasteboard counters, and a fine black ribbon, cut cleanly as though by a razor. He took it up. "From the porch's frame." "Yes, sir," said Mrs. Blount. "The frame's ribbon was found on the floor that morning. I thought the raven's wings had caught it." "Wings do not cut, Mrs. Blount," Holmes returned with a courtesy that did not blunt the spear of his meaning. "Blades cut, or steel teeth?" "Teeth," Lestrade repeated. "You suggest, Mr. Holmes, that a contrivance lowered from the cornice nipped the ribbon and set the portrait awry, to draw attention." Holmes's smile was quick and unreadable. "When a conjurer wishes you to observe his left hand, it is because the right is elsewhere. Consider, A room found fast, windows seemingly untouched, a door with the scratch of a jeweler's triangular blade, a mantle that bears the print not of fingers, but of something set down from above, a fiber from the cornice, a sliver of cog, in the fire, a scent upon machine oil that is not English manufacture, and a smear of Prussian blue bound with wax near the bell pull. What do these letters spell, Lestrade? The inspector sniffed. French nonsense. Ah, said Holmes softly, but letters reversed, spelled truths seen askance. He straightened and faced our client. Mr. Pennington, you told us last night that you had no enemies. That may be so in the vulgar sense, but there is a kind of enemy a barrister makes without knowing it. Does the name Mr. Sabine mean anything to you? Pennington's brow furrowed. Sabine? I know. Not that I recall. Then we shall set him aside with the rest of our ghosts, Holmes returned, as if the name had risen from the very grain of the wood. He turned to Lestrade. You will, I hope, permit me to examine the raven kept at the yard. It may be that this second bird will show where the first was reticent. Lestrade hesitated, then nodded. This afternoon. But see here, Mr. Holmes, if I must have a servant up before the magistrate, I shall not be delayed by feathered toys. Delay's the mother of accuracy, Holmes rejoined. There is a hand at work in this house that opened no door and yet came in, that left a bird and took nothing, that strangled a man not for his purse but for his silence. He moved to the hearth once more and, with a decisive motion, stirred the coals until a small pop sent a spark winking onto the stone. He pounced at once, pinched it out, and showed me, gleaming in his fingers, another minuteness of metal, toothed and twinned to the first. A second cog, I cried. One does not lose cogs without cause, said Holmes. Watson, your handkerchief. He wrapped both specimens carefully and slipped them into his pocket. Mr. Pennington, until I have seen your stables and your late coachman's quarters, I can do no more here, Inspector. I shall trespass upon your patience only so far as is necessary to learn how a raven sings. And when it sings, Lestrade said half derisive, the truth shall break, so the letter says. Holmes's face, in that moment, became for an instant austere. Some truths break like light through shutters, he said. Others, like glass. We shall try to avoid the latter. We left the study with its silent bird and passed again into the hall, where a footman hovered like a shadow. Holmes's eyes rested upon the fellow for the fraction of a second upon his hands, which bore a faint discoloration between the thumb and forefinger, and upon the stitching of his cuff, where a thread had been hastily knotted. He asked no question. He seldom did at the first turn. In the mews behind the house the fog lay thicker, pooled in the gutters and drifting in pale veils about the wheel ruts. A policeman paced with the automatic gravity of his kind, and a stable boy, a freckled creature, with an honest, terrified gaze, pointed mutely to the door upon which the second raven had been found. Holmes stooped and inspected the lintel, the latch, and at last the earth where the coachman's body had lain. His gaze was swift, unerring. He lifted his head after a time and said only, "So, not a seaman, then, not a—" I began. But already he had turned toward the house again. His features, wearing that curious expression I have elsewhere described, half inward satisfaction, half reluctant acknowledgment of a mind worthy to oppose his own. "Watson," he murmured, as we re-entered the hall, "there is a language spoken by machines which men seldom trouble to learn. When they do, they write poems in iron. We are dealing with a poet. And the locked room?" I asked. "We shall unlock it," he said, "when we have found the key that is not a key." It was, I confess, no more than one of those oblique utterances with which he delighted to whet my curiosity. Yet as we took our leave of No. 17 for the present Holmes, with his 2 infinitesimal cogs, I with a mind more filled with questions than answers, I could not shake the sensation that, somewhere above our heads, some hidden spring had been set, that attention, invisible yet inexorable, was winding toward its appointed release. Lestrade will arrest a servant before the clock strikes 4, Holmes observed, as we regained our handsomeness. It will be a useful mistake. Useful? To the man who sees, he said, and rapped upon the roof for home. Chapter 3. The Singing Mechanism. When I look back upon that morning's events, I cannot help but recall the precise manner in which Holmes's interest sharpened at the very moment others' curiosity faltered. Lestrade, content with his theory of domestic guilt, had retired to the yard to draw up warrants. Pennington, shaken and pale, withdrew to his upstairs chamber, and the household staff, moving through their duties with hushed steps, spoke in frightened whispers of the bird as though it were some low-wand familiar. Holmes, however, remained at the center of it all, like a watchmaker studying a clock whose workings only he could see. By 10:30, we were again seated in a hansom, rattling toward Scotland Yard to examine the second Raven. The fog had thickened into a heavy pall that pressed low upon the city, blurring outlines and muffling sound. I remember the clatter of the horses' hooves diminishing to a dull percussion. Like a heartbeat heard through cloth, Holmes was silent. For most of the journey, his long fingers tapping absently against his knee in a rhythm I recognized from previous cases, a sign that his mind was constructing some elaborate internal edifice. At length, he spoke. "You observed, Watson, that the first Raven bore the scent of bird?" "I did," I replied. "It was faint, but unmistakable. Indeed, such oil is not native to English workshops. A single craftsman of my acquaintance used it regularly to mask the odor of his lubricants. He worked, until recently, in the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honore, Paris," I exclaimed. Holmes inclined his head. The precision of the mechanism, the slivered cogs, the triangular scratch upon the escutcheon speak of continental methods. London burglars favor brute force. This mind favors finesse. We are not dealing with an idle prankster, Watson, but with a technician and artificer whose hands are as deft as a surgeon's. We arrived at the yard and were conducted to a small evidence room, cold and ill-lit, where on a wooden table lay the second Raven. It was identical to the first in form and finish. Wings spread, eyes of obsidian glass, a winding key at its base. Its brass feathers caught what little light there was, gleaming with a subdued malevolence. Holmes bent over it like a naturalist examining some rare and poisonous insect. "Have you wound it?" he asked the constable in attendance. "No, sir. Inspector said to leave it be until you came." "Wise man, Lestrade," Holmes murmured. He drew from his pocket a pair of fine tweezers and a small magnifying lens. "Watson, attend." He rotated the Raven gently, inspecting the seams of its body, the tiny screws at its joints, and the keyhole beneath. Then, with the care of a man diffusing a hidden charge, he inserted the key and gave a single, deliberate turn. At once, the bird emitted a soft ticking, regular and mechanical. Its wings gave the faintest tremor, and then without warning its beak opened with a metallic click. From within came a sound that made the constable cross himself. Not a song, precisely, but a delicate chime of notes, like a music box wound too tight. It rose in a brief, eerie melody that ended with a click so sharp it echoed through the small room. Holmes's eyes lit with fierce delight. "Beautiful," he whispered. "Absolutely beautiful." I, for my part, felt something less than delight. There was a calculated eeriness to that clockwork melody, as though it had been designed not merely to charm, but to unsettle. Holmes bent closer still. "Do you perceive it, Watson? The cadence?" "It seems irregular," I admitted. "Not quite a tune." "Precisely. A code, Watson. Or at the very least, a patterned message. 7 chimes, then a pause, then 5 like a tapped signal. It is not intended for the ear of the layman." He turned the raven over and examined its base. "Ah," he murmured, "here is the heart of the matter." With his tweezers he extracted a minute slip of folded paper, hidden within a hollow recess beneath the winding mechanism. He unfolded it carefully. Upon the slip was a single inked mark. A raven in silhouette, with the letters S.C. scrawled beneath in an elegant, unfamiliar hand. Holmes stared at it for some moments, then slipped it into his notebook. Not the signature of an assassin, but of an artisan. S.C. Sabine, Clockworks, Paris. I knew it. You've encountered them before. Once. They produced mechanical birds for courtiers of the Second Empire, masterpieces of clockwork deception. But this, he gestured to the raven, this is their work turned to darker ends. And consider, Watson, the letter Pennington received. When the raven sings, the truth shall break. These ravens sing only when wounded. Therefore, their song is a signal, a message to someone else, perhaps, or the trigger for some other mechanism. I felt a chill. You think the ravens are part of a larger plan? I do not think so, Watson. I know. As we left the yard, Holmes paused on the steps, drawing his cloak more tightly around him. This artificer moves unseen, places his birds in locked rooms, strangles coachmen without theft, and leaves behind clues so fine that only a mind attuned to precision would notice them. Why? Not for money, not for vengeance alone. There is a performance to it, a deliberate staging. We took another cab back toward Belgravia, this time diverting to examine the coachman's quarters in the mews. It was a humble room above the stable, with a single iron bedstead, a battered trunk, and a table with a half-written letter upon it. Holmes moved about the room in silence, touching nothing but observing everything. At length, he stopped before the letter. Watson read, "This." It was addressed to dearest Alice, and spoke of his intent to confess something troubling the following evening. The letter broke off mid-sentence. Holmes examined the nib of the pen, the ink blot where it had been abandoned. No sign of forced entry, I noted. He stopped writing suddenly. "Strangled without theft," Holmes murmured. "And about to confess something. A servant who knew too much, saw too much. Our artificer does not tolerate witnesses." Before we left, Holmes crouched by the threshold and plucked a small metallic shaving from the florist's liver, blue-tinged and curved. "Another cog fragment," I said. "No," he replied softly. "A spring coiled, then broken. This was left behind." We returned to Baker Street that evening under a sullen sky. Holmes was in high spirits, not cheerful, but sharpened, like a blade newly honed. He spent an hour at his workbench dismantling the second raven, laying its innards out in a neat array. Gears no larger than a fingernail, tiny hammers, toothed wheels, and hidden compartments. At the center was a clever escapement that, when tripped, released the paper slip. "Whoever built this," Holmes said, possesses skill to rival Fabergé and cunning to match any criminal mind in Europe. And yet, Watson—" He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "They want us to follow. Each raven is a message as much as it is a device. He is leading us somewhere." I watched the mechanical raven disassembled upon the table like a bird gutted by a meticulous surgeon. Outside, the fog pressed against the window panes. Holmes straightened, his expression unreadable. "Tomorrow, we return to Belgravia. The locked room has not yet yielded its full story. There is a detail, a single thread that I have yet to pluck." He tapped the raven's tiny key against his teeth, like a conductor tapping a baton. "And when I find it," he murmured, "the song will change." Chapter 5. The whispers and brass. For the remainder of that day, Holmes was possessed of a singular intensity, the sort that made conversation with him rather like attempting to hold water in a sieve. He would reply to questions in brief, distracted phrases, pace the length of our sitting room in long, measured strides, then drop abruptly to his workbench to sketch or examine some minute piece of evidence through his lens. The fragments of cog from the Belgravia hearth, the rough jagir from Shaw's pouch, and several slivers of brass from the raven itself were arranged in neat lines upon white paper, labeled in his hand with letters and symbols that I did not at the time understands. It was late afternoon, the fog outside thick as muslin, when Holmes suddenly ceased his pacing and stood before the fire with his hands clasped behind his back. His face wore that expression I had seen on rare occasions when the pieces of some intricate puzzle had clicked together in his mind, though he would not yet share the picture they formed. "Watson," he said at last, "tell me what you see." I rose and approached the table obediently. "Fragments of the raven mechanism," I said. "The two cog segments from the hearth, the damaged one from Shaw, and several slivers of brass from the bird you dismantled at the yard." "Good," he murmured. "And how do they differ?" "Oh, doctor," she cried, "thank heavens you're back. Mr. Holmes is upstairs, but there's a man in the sitting room fair beside himself." I hurried up and found Holmes standing beside the fire with his usual composure, while Inspector Lestrade paced the room with his bowler hat clutched between his hands. His face was flushed, his collar slightly askew, rare state for the normally precise inspector. "He's gone, Holmes," Lestrade burst out as soon as I entered. "Vanished without a trace." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "You refer, I presume, to Mr. Pennington?" Lestrade stopped dead. "How the devil did you know?" Holmes inclined his head ever so slightly. "You carry no warrant, yet you come to Baker Street unannounced at this hour, in evident agitation, with mud upon your boots that matchies the gravel path of Belgravia Square. There is only one man whose disappearance could provoke such a reaction from you at this stage of the case." Lestrade made a sound between a groan and a laugh. "I don't know whether you're a genius or a fiend. Yes, it's Pennington. His valet found his bed unslept in this morning. No one saw him leave the house. The front door was locked, windows bolted. He's simply gone." Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "At what hour was he last seen?" 10:30 last night," Lestrade replied. "He dismissed his valet, said he'd retire. There was no sound after that. At 7 this morning, his door was found ajar, his bed undisturbed, and a single item upon his writing desk." "What item?" Lestrade produced a sealed envelope from his coat pocket. Holmes took it delicately and held it to the light. The paper was the same fine, continental stock as the first letter, unmarked by watermark. The seal bore the imprint of a raven in flight. Holmes broke it carefully. Inside was a single line, written in the same elegant hand, The mouth of the Raven opens at midnight. No signature. No further instruction. Found on his desk, you say? Holmes asked. Dubquats. Yes. As if he'd written something and torn it up, but this was all that remained. Holmes examined the edges of the paper, torn from a larger sheet. Pennington either began to write a response or was compelled to discard it midway. Curious. Did anyone in the household hear anything unusual during the night? Nothing, Lestrade replied. And before you asked, the study was locked, the hidden panel untouched. No new Raven has appeared. A search without footprints by noon. Holmes, Lestrade and I were back at No. 17 Belgravia Square. The household was in a state of restrained panic. Mrs. Blount clutched her apron with trembling fingers, and the footman Shaw hovered anxiously in the hallway, now freed but clearly under suspicion in the minds of others. Holmes moved through the house with swift, silent purpose. He examined Pennington's bedroom first. Bed immaculate, curtains undisturbed. A single candle burned down halfway upon the desk. No sign of struggle, no open window, no footprints on the carpet beyond Pennington's own slippers. His walking stick still leaned in its usual corner. His coat hung neatly on the rack. There was nothing to suggest a man who had planned to leave of his own accord. Watson, Holmes said suddenly, pointing to the desk. What do you make of that? I bent down. There on the wood near the letter lay a faint sprinkling of fine powder blue-gray, almost metallic. Prussian blue, I said, recalling the earlier discovery near the bell pull. Exactly. And note how it is smeared, not scattered. He leaned upon it, perhaps unconsciously, after touching something connected to the hidden mechanism in the study, which tells us that, shortly before his disappearance, Mr. Pennington's hands were in contact with the device. But for what purpose? I asked. That, Holmes replied, is precisely the question. The empty study, the study itself, offered more troubling evidence. The Raven remained absent from the mantel, but a faint ticking echoed within the walls when Holmes pressed his ear to the cornice. It was not the bold, clean ticking of clockwork in motion, but the slow, dying heartbeat of a mechanism winding down. Holmes fetched a chair, climbed it, and pressed along the cornice. A narrow panel slid back beneath his fingers, revealing the cavity that housed the descending arm. It was empty. The clawed mechanism was gone. Removed, Holmes murmured. And recently. See the faint smear of oil along the groove? Someone with access to the wall took the device. Lestrade swore softly. So the whole mechanism's been spirited away and Pennington's vanished in the night. If this is your Parisian clockmaker, Holmes, he's a ghost. Holmes stepped down, eyes glittering with that cold light I had come to associate with his most dangerous cases. Not a ghost, Lestrade, a watchmaker. And like all watchmakers, he works by exact intervals. This disappearance is no random abduction. It was scheduled. Scheduled. Holmes gestured to the letter. The mouth of the Raven opens at midnight. It is both a taunt and a timetable. The Raven's mouth evening fell swiftly over London that day, the fog thickening until the lamps were mere halos of dim gold in the gloom. Holmes insisted we remain at No. 17 through the night. The stage has been reset, he told Lestrade. The artificer has removed one piece and placed another. Midnight is the hour. We must be here when the Raven's mouth opens. By 10 o'clock, the house was silent save for the occasional creak of settling timbers. Lestrade stationed 2 constables outside the front and rear entrances, while Holmes, the inspector, and I took up our vigil in the study. Holmes sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the cornice. A single lamp burned low, casting long shadows across the room. Midnight approached, at precisely 5 minutes to the hour. The ticking began again. This time, it was unmistakable, a steady, rhythmic sound from somewhere inside the wall. The panel in the cornice shifted with a soft scrape. Holmes tensed, signaling us to silence. From the aperture extended not the delicate arm we had seen before, but a larger, more complex assembly, something like a hinged claw with a tiny bell at its center. The mechanism stopped, suspended in the air like some predatory insect. Then, with a soft metallic snap, the bell opened. It was not a bell at all. It was a mouth, 2 thin metal plates, unfolded like jaws, revealing a hollow interior lined with a spiral of thin brass. A voice of such it can be called emanated from within. Not a human voice, but a tinny, chime-like speech, as though words were being rendered through a machine built for music. Not language. It spoke a single phrase, repeated twice. He walks beneath the raven's wings. Then the mouth snapped shut. The mechanism retracted smoothly into the wall and disappeared. The room was utterly silent. Lestrade exhaled. What in God's name was that? Holmes's voice was low. A message. Not for us, for Pennington. Holmes's quiet realization. The inspector immediately set the house into frantic motion. Servants questioned again. Searches conducted from cellar to roof, but Pennington was not found. It was as though he had melted into the fog. Holmes, however, did not participate in this flurry. He stood by the mantel, hands behind his back, staring at the cornice with an intensity that chilled me. His eyes flicked once toward the bell pull, once toward the floor beneath the panel, and then to the Prussian blue residue he had found in Pennington's room. Watson, he said at last, quietly, this is no mere disappearance. This is the next movement in the artist's design. Do you think Pennington is alive? He looked at me, and for the briefest instant, I thought I saw hesitation, rare, fleeting, like a crack in polished marble. I think, he said slowly, that he's where he was meant to be. The Ravens' game week returned to Baker Street in the cold hour before dawn, our hansom rattling through fog-choked streets like a coffin on wheels. Holmes spoke little on the journey, save for one cryptic remark. The Raven does not merely herald death, Watson. It directs it. And so Mr. Aldous Pennington, retired barrister of Belgravia Square, vanished from his locked house without a sound, leaving behind only a single line and a machine that spoke in chimes. London awoke the next morning to whispered rumors in gentlemen's clubs and drawing rooms that a prominent lawyer had been spirited away by means so mysterious that even Scotland Yard was baffled. Only Holmes remained calm, and yet I could tell from the way he turned the marked cog over and over in his fingers that something within him had shifted, that the artificer's game had grown darker and the stakes higher. The Raven had called twice, and somewhere in the city, the dead or the soon-to-be were waiting to speak. Chapter 8. The trap is set in all the years I have known Sherlock Holmes. There have been times when his methods have baffled even my closest understanding of his habits. But never, I think, was I more thoroughly in the dark than during the week that followed Lestrade's pursuit of the valet Corbett. Holmes, ordinarily so transparent to my eye in the heat of investigation, withdrew into a state of quiet, almost surgical secrecy. He spent long hours away from Baker Street, returning with smudges of brass filings on his cuffs and a distant, gleaming look in his eyes, as though we were playing a game of chess with an opponent only he could see. I suspected, of course, that he was laying some plan to expose the true hand behind the ravens. But of its nature and execution I was entirely ignorant. Holmes grows unreachable. One morning I rose to find his room empty, his bed unslept in, and a single note left upon the mantel of our sitting room. In Holmes's precise hand, it read, "Watson, do not be alarmed if I am absent for a day or two. Watch the evening papers. S.H. It was maddeningly brief, even by his standards. I spent those 2 days in restless uncertainty, attending to my patients by day and poring over the fragments of the case by night. Pennington's letter, the raven mechanisms, the tooth, the coded phrases. But the more I examined them, the more I felt as though I were peering at pieces of an elaborate puzzle without the key to its construction. On the evening of the second day, I returned to Baker Street to find Holmes sitting in his armchair once more, wrapped in his dressing gown, looking for all the world as though he had never left. And yet there was something different in him, a sharpened focus, attention coiled beneath his composed exterior. He greeted me with his usual warmth. "Ah, Watson, I trust you've kept the hearth burning in my absence." "I've done more than that," I said irritably. "I've been worrying myself sick." "Where on earth have you been?" He gave a slight, sardonic smile. "Everywhere. And nowhere. But I have returned with exactly what I required." I stared at him. "Holmes, if you are working on some stratagem, I insist upon knowing at least part of it." "My dear fellow," he said with that infuriating gentleness, "if I told you now, I should rob you of the pleasure of astonishment later. Have patience. The moment is ripening." A newspaper notice the following morning's Times carried a small notice, placed deep in the classified advertisements where only the most attentive might find it. "To the gentleman of the raven. The wings have spread, but the beak remains closed. Midnight shall find the nest unguarded." A friend of the clock eye read it aloud over breakfast. My brow furrowed. "Holmes, is this one of you doing?" He did not look up from buttering his toast. "It is. But to whom is it addressed?" "To the man we seek, naturally. He is watching the papers as keenly as we are. Men of his temperament often harbor a kind of vanity, Watson. They delight in riddles, but delight even more when someone replies in kind. It is irresistible to them." "Then you intend to bait the hook," Holmes said simply, "and I expect the fish to nibble tonight." The return to Belgravia we returned to No. 17 Belgravia Square that evening under cover of a heavy fog. It pressed close against the lamps like damp wool. Lestrade, though still mired in his misguided prosecution of Corbett, had reluctantly agreed to keep his men out of the house for the night, to avoid scaring off the accomplice, as Holmes phrased it. This left the house silent, deserted but for the echoes of our footsteps in the hall. Holmes moved through the rooms with quiet assurance. He carried with him a small satchel, the contents of which he guarded jealously. When I inquired, he only smiled faintly and said, "All in good time, Watson." In the study, he set about his preparations. First, he placed the disassembled raven now repaired back upon the mantel. Next, he produced from his satchel a small mechanical device of his own making, a thin brass wire fitted with a bell-shaped receiver and a wax ear tube, which he ran behind the cornice panel where the raven mechanism had once descended. "It is a simple listening device," he explained. "Any movement within the wall will reach us before it manifests." Then, to my astonishment, he donned the livery of a footman. The transformation was uncanny. His keen gray eyes took on a deferential droop. His posture shifted to the unobtrusive stillness of a trained servant, and his precise diction softened into the clipped tones of domestic speech. With the addition of a plain cap and gloves, he could easily have passed for one of Pennington's staff. "Holmes?" I exclaimed. "What on earth?" He silenced me with a finger to his lips. "Our artificer believes this house was unwatched tonight. He will not approach if he senses Scotland Yard's presence, but a servant slipping through the hallways, a footman on some domestic errand that he may not fear, and my role, precisely what it has always been," he said with a dry smile, "to observe and, when necessary, to prevent me from being stabbed in the back." The midnight watch clock struck 11 as we extinguished the lamps and took up our positions. Holmes stationed himself in the servants' corridor, his disguise complete, while I remained in the study behind the heavy curtains, my view of the mantel clear. The fog outside muffled all sound. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. Time passed slowly, each tick of the clock stretching the silence taut. Midnight approached, and then, faintly at first, I heard it, a soft worry within the wall. Holmes's device on the mantel gave a delicate chime of warning. I froze, my heart pounding. From the cornice, a narrow slit opened. A mechanical arm, new, more elaborate than before, descended. This one bore not a raven, nor a pouch, but a small lantern, unlit, with strange etchings on its surface. It was lowered with perfect silence and precision until it hung just above the raven on the mantel. Then came a second sound: footsteps. Soft, measured, approaching down the corridor. Holmes's voice rang out, not in his usual tone, but in the clipped, deferential voice of a servant. "Who's there?" The footsteps paused. I dared to glance through the crack in the door. A figure stood at the far end of the corridor, tall, wrapped in a dark overcoat, with a hat pulled low. The fog behind him seeped into the hallway like a living thing. He stood perfectly still for a heartbeat. Then, without a word, he moved forward. Again swift, purposeful. The man reached the study doorway and paused. Holmes, still in his footman's garb, affected a startled look. "Beg pardon, sir. I didn't expect." The stranger raised a gloved hand and spoke, in accented but precise English. "Leave." The single word carried such cold authority that for a moment, even I felt the urge to obey. Holmes bowed and stepped back, playing his part to perfection, allowing the man to enter the study. He moved with quiet confidence, as if the house belonged to him. His gaze swept over the raven, the unlit lantern, the mantel, and finally the hidden panel above. Then he reached into his coat and produced a key, a long, delicate, three-pronged key unlike any I had seen before. He inserted it into the lantern's base and turned it with a soft click. The lantern flared to life with a pale green light, and at that same moment, Holmes struck. He came up behind the man in a flash, dropping his disguise in the same breath. One hand seized the man's wrist, wrenching it upward. The other clamped down on his shoulder. The stranger reacted with startling speed, spinning, almost inhumanly. Fluid, but Holmes had anticipated the movement, driving him toward the mantel. For a brief moment, the two figures struggled in the eerie lantern light. Then Holmes forced him against the wall, wrenching the key from his grasp. "Good evening," Holmes said softly. "I've been expecting you." The man's eyes, pale gray, cold as steel, regarded him without fear. "You are clever," he said in his accented voice, "but you are late." The sudden escape before I could move to assist. The stranger twisted with astonishing strength, wrenching free of Holmes's grip. His hand darted toward the wall and pressed some hidden release. The cornice panel snapped shut, and the lantern went dark. Holmes lunged, but the man was already moving out into the fog-choked corridor. I dashed from my hiding place to follow. We burst into the night, but the fog had grown so dense that it was like pursuing a shadow through a cloud. His footsteps faded, then ceased altogether. He was gone. Holmes stood on the steps, breathing hard but not defeated. In his hand, he still held the stranger's strange three-pronged key. He turned it over once, twice, then slipped it into his pocket. "Watson," he said quietly, "the artificer has taken the bait. But he is not finished." Tonight was his test and ours. The cabac at Baker Street in the early hours. Holmes examined the key under his lens with an almost reverent focus. "It is unique," he said, hand-forged three-pronged, to fit. "A specific locking mechanism, one not of English manufacture. This, Watson, is the key to the Raven's mouth." He leaned back, his eyes gleaming with something fierce and cold. "And when next that mouth opens, we shall be ready to hear what it truly has to say." The artificer had revealed himself, if only briefly. The trap had been sprung. But the game, as Holmes himself admitted, was far from over. And somewhere in London, the Raven's next call was being prepared. Chapter 9. The Gathering of Shadows. The events of that fog-drenched night altered the complexion of the case in a way I could not then fully comprehend. Holmes had laid his trap, and though the artificer had evaded capture, the encounter left behind something far more valuable than a prisoner, the three-pronged key. From the moment Holmes slipped it into his breast pocket, his entire bearing shifted. It was as though he now possessed the final missing piece of a cipher, and was merely waiting for the proper moment to apply it. The following 2 days passed in feverish activity. Holmes dispatched telegrams to half a dozen corners of Europe, conferred in private with 2 French visitors who arrived at Baker Street under cover of darkness, and spent hours in the back room of a clockmaker's shop in Clockenwell. He returned one evening with a faint smear of blue wax on his fingers and eyes alight with a fierce, controlled satisfaction. "It is nearly time, Watson," he said simply. "Holmes summons the players on the morning of the 3rd day." Holmes sat at his desk and wrote a series of notes with swift precision. When I glanced at the list of recipients, my eyebrows rose. Inspector Lestrade, Scotland Yard Mr. Aldous Pennington, or, if not found, his solicitor James Corbett. The valet, Frederick Shaw, the footman, Mrs. Blount, housekeeper. Of no. 17 Belgravia Square, a Mr. Henry Sabine. Recently arrived from Paris. When I questioned him, Holmes only said, "The clock has struck 11, Watson. It is time to call the company together before midnight." By that evening, all had gathered in the study at No. 17 Belgravia Square, summoned by Holmes's imperious notes. Lestrade was first to arrive, exasperated but curious. "I hope you're not wasting my time, Holmes. I've still half a mind to proceed with the charges against Corbett." "You shall shortly possess a full mind," Holmes replied coolly. "Pray, restrain your enthusiasm until the last chime." Next came Corbett and Shaw, brought by Lestrade's men but no longer in handcuffs. Both looked bewildered, though Corbett maintained his rigid dignity. Mrs. Blount entered with trembling hands, clutching her shawl as though to ward off ghosts. The final arrival was Mr. Henry Sabine. He was precisely the man I had glimpsed in the fog weeks earlier. Leanne, sharp-faced, with a neatly trimmed goatee and eyes of cold gray steel. He entered without hesitation, offered Holmes a small bow, and took a seat as though attending a private performance. His presence filled the room with an unsettling stillness, as though some finely wound spring had been brought into proximity with fire. "Mr. Sabine," Holmes said smoothly, "how kind of you to answer my summons." Sabine's English was lightly accented. When one receives an invitation signed by Sherlock Holmes, one is a fool to ignore it. The raven's mouth Holmes rose, the three-pronged key in hand. "Gentlemen, and Mrs. Blount," he began, "you have all been, in various ways, actors upon a stage you did not know existed. A stage set by this man," he inclined his head toward Sabine, "and by the late Aldous Pennington." Gasps echoed through the room. "Late," Lestrade barked. "Do you mean he's dead?" Holmes's gaze was like a scalpel. "He is not merely dead, Lestrade. He was murdered by design so meticulous that, until the mechanism completed its final act, even I could not see the full machinery." He stepped to the mantel. The raven had been reassembled and placed back in its position of sinister poise. Above it, the narrow slit in the cornice stood ready. Holmes inserted the key into the base of the raven and turned it once. A soft click. The walled mechanism began to hum. From the slit, the clawed arm descended, bearing once again the strange lantern we had seen on the night of our encounter with Sabine. Holmes let it settle above the raven, then stepped back. "This," he said, gesturing to the apparatus, "is the artificer's masterpiece. A communication device, a signaling system, and most chillingly a timed executioner." Lestrade snorted. "Executioner? It's a lantern on a hook." "Patience, Inspector." Holmes turned the key again. The lantern flared to life with its pale green glow. From within came the now familiar Shimi Musicao, Arid. But this time, Holmes adjusted something on the raven's base, and the chime resolved into a pattern. 7 tones, pause, 5 tones, pause, 2 tones. 752, I murmured. Holmes nodded a coordinate, a code used by Sabine's network of Clockwork operatives. 752 is a location, the 7th house, 5th floor, 2nd room of a certain warehouse on the Thames. That, Lestrade, is where Mr. Pennington's body now lies. A shocked silence fell over the room. Holmes continued, his voice cool and precise. Aldous Pennington was not an innocent victim. He was a barrister who, 20 years ago, secured the conviction of Sabine's brother, a brilliant horologist, accused of treason and sabotage in France. The brother died in prison. Henry Sabine, here present, vowed to exact vengeance with the same tools his brother mastered: precision, patience, and machines that speak when men are silent. All eyes turned to Sabine. He neither flinched nor denied it. Instead, he smiled faintly. "Very good, Monsieur Holmes. 'Tis been the perfect mechanism." Holmes gestured to the hidden panel in the wall. "Sabine gained entry to the house not by doors or windows, but by installing monks in advance a concealed mechanism within the cornice." He posed as a decorative artisan employed to restore the mantel and cornices after Mrs. Pennington's death. With the family distracted, he built this clockwork system piece by piece, hidden in plain sight. Mrs. Blount gave a faint cry. "I remember. A French gentleman came to fix the cornice after the funeral. He worked alone. At night Mr. Pennington trusted him." Holmes nodded, and thus the raven's mouth was placed. At precise intervals, Sabine delivered his messages encoded, in chimes to lure Pennington into a final trap. The first raven was placed to frighten him, the second to draw him into the study at night, the third to summon him to his doom. The phrase "he walks beneath the raven's wings" was no poetic flourish. What's in it was an instruction. At midnight, Pennington followed the sound into the servants' corridor, where Sabine waited. He turned to Sabine. "I imagine you chloroformed him, perhaps within 3 seconds of the lantern's flare." Sabine inclined his head. 2.5. Holmes smiled thinly. Impressive. He was then smuggled out through the coal chute into a waiting carriage and taken to the Thames warehouse. A single slip of paper, placed on his desk, completed the illusion of voluntary departure. The Foss Trails Lestrade, to his credit, was listening now with rapt attention. Holmes turned to him. "As for your suspects, Inspector the footman Shaw was merely curious, and his rough cog was the work of a boy attempting to imitate what he saw." Corbett's possession of the true cogs was explained by Pennington's careless disposal. Each false clue was either planted by Sabine or arose naturally from the household's own habits, and Sabine, clever man, knew how to let those false trails grow wild. Lestrade flushed, and the coachman Holmes's eyes hardened. He saw something he should not. Perhaps he witnessed the nocturnal adjustment of the cornice mechanism. Sabine silenced him without theft or struggle or strangulation, executed with mechanical precision. A man who kills like a clock winds down only when the spring is spent. The final proof. Holmes approached Sabine slowly. "You came here that night to test your mechanism one final time. But you dropped this." He held up the 3-pronged key. "Without it, the lantern could not be fully activated. You were forced to retreat, but you knew the mechanism had already served its purpose. Pennington was dead by then." Sabine gave a small shrug. "And yet, Monsieur Holmes, you have only my presence here. No weapon, no confession." Holmes's smile widened, cold as the Thames. "On the contrary, you will find that Lestrade's men, acting upon a certain anonymous telegram, raided the Thames warehouse 2 hours ago." The door opened at that moment, and a yard sergeant entered, saluting Lestrade. "Sir, we found him." Body in the warehouse, just as described, tied to a chair. A clockwork raven perched above him. "Been dead for 2 nights. A collective gasp filled the room. Mrs. Blount covered her mouth. Corbett and Shaw crossed themselves. Sabine's smile faded at last. The unmasking Holmes moved with quiet authority. "Henry Sabine, I charge you with the murder of Aldous Pennington and the killing of John Dawes, the coachman. Your artistry is remarkable. Your cruelty, more so. But your mechanism, like all mechanisms, contains a flaw. It cannot account for the unpredictable hand of human intervention. You misjudged me." Sabine rose slowly, his still gray eyes glittering. "No, Monsieur Holmes, I judged you perfectly. That is why I allowed you to find me." Holmes's gaze sharpened, aloud. Sabine spread his hands. "Every clock must have its winding key. You have found mine, but I assure you the clock has not yet stopped." Before anyone could react, he reached into his coat and flung a small brass sphere. "To the ground!" Holmes shouted. "Back!" But the sphere only burst with a cloud of thick, acrid smoke. When it cleared, Sabine was gone. Holmes's composer Lestrade cursed. "Blast it!" He slipped away. Holmes remained perfectly calm. "No, Inspector. He has merely fled into the next act. But now the audience knows the playwright." He turned to me with that rare glint of exhilaration in his eyes. "Watson, we have broken the artist's script. From this point, the improvisation begins." And so, in that fog-dimmed study, Holmes revealed the full mechanism of the Raven mystery, yet the artificer himself, like some malevolent phantom, eluded capture. The stage was set for the final confrontation, and though we did not know it, then London's fog would soon witness a pursuit as intricate and perilous as the case itself. Chapter X. The aftermath in the chase. It has often struck me, in looking back upon the cases I have shared with Sherlock Holmes, that the moment of revelation, that instant in which his deductions are laid bare before Ale, is seldom the end of the matter. More often than not, it is merely the point at which the true adversary throws off his disguise and flees, like a stag breaking cover after long circling. So it was in the affair of the Clockwork Raven, the unveiling of Henry, Sabine's mechanism at No. 17 Belgravia Square had shattered the elaborate web of misdirection he had spun, but the man himself had escaped into the fog-swift cunning. And more dangerous than ever, London stirs in panic by the following morning. The news of Sabine's unmasking had spread with astonishing speed. The Morning Chronicle ran the headline, "The Raven Speaks Murderer at Large in Lowendoe," and other papers followed suit, each more sensational than the last. Stories of mechanical birds heralding death swept through clubs and drawing rooms. Rumors. Florche Sabine was said to have fled to France, or hidden in the sewers beneath the city, or taken refuge in the clock tower of St. Pancras Station. All of London seemed caught between fascination and fear, as if the idea of a killer who built death into machine struck some deep chord in the Victorian imagination. Holmes, for his part, was entirely unmoved by the hysteria. When I entered our sitting room that morning, I found him seated at the breakfast table in his dressing gown, calmly scanning the foreign columns of Le Figaro. A single telegram lay beside his plate, its contents brief: "Lion Sabine left too. Weeks ago. Trail cold. Watch London." Holmes folded the paper. "He has nowhere else to go." "You think he's still in London?" I asked. "I know he is," Holmes replied evenly. "Sabine is not a common criminal. He does not run blindly. He retreats like a clock spring tightly, methodically. He will strike once more, Watson. That is his nature. He must complete his design." Lestrade's net tightens. Inspector Lestrade arrived shortly after, looking both harried and chastened. The events at Belgravia had made him the subject of considerable ribbing at the yard, and his eagerness to redeem himself was plain. "We've set up watchers at the docks, the railway stations, and all known French cafes," he reported briskly. "Nothing. He's a ghost." Holmes shook his head. "Not a ghost, Inspector. A craftsman. And every craftsman requires his tools. Have you placed surveillance on clockmakers' shops, mechanical ateliers, and import merchants dealing?" "In fine brass." Lestrade blinked. "On what?" Holmes gave him a look that would have withered a more sensitive man. "Sabine's mechanisms require maintenance. He cannot work without access to gears, escapements, oils, springs, or a lathe. He may have concealed himself, but his hands will betray him. Watch the tool shops, not the ports." Lestrade scribbled this down with the air of a man playing catch-up. "Very well. And what of Pennington's body?" "Forensics say he was chloroformed, then garroted. Death between midnight and 1 o'clock, the night of his disappearance. No prints, no personal effects, no witnesses." Holmes rose, pacing before the hearth. "Sabine left no witnesses because he considers his work art. He stages every act like a theater piece. He will not hide forever. His temperament won't allow it. He will attempt to outdo himself, perhaps, to strike at me, perhaps to demonstrate his superiority. That is why he remains in London." Lestrade sighed. "Then what do you suggest? We can't see every corner of the city." No, Holmes said softly, but we can predict his stage. The warehouse that afternoon, Holmes and I accompanied Lestrade's to the Thames warehouse, where Pennington's body had been found. It stood in a desolate stretch of riverfront, hemmed in by abandoned yards and the silent hulks of coal barges. The fog here hung thicker, clinging to the timbers and coiling along the ground like smoke from some subterranean fire. Inside the warehouse, the scene was as Holmes had described during his revelation. In the center of the room stood a wooden chair, to which Pennington's lifeless body had been bound. Above it, nailed to a beam, was a third raven. This one was slightly larger, its wings outstretched in a grotesque parody of flight. The air was thick with the faint scent of machine oil and bergamot. Holmes examined the raven with meticulous care. He removed his gloves, ran a finger along its wings, and peered into its open beak. Here, he murmured. He tested anew. Vocal mechanism? Note the twin brass reeds. This was not merely a message, it was a rehearsal. The final performance will not be in a deserted warehouse. I shuddered. Final performance? Sabine is an artist, Watson. An artist never ends with a rehearsal. He will choose a place where his work will be seen and by those who matter. Holmes then directed Lestrade's men to examine the rafters. There, in the gloom, they discovered a small, narrow crawl space hidden between beams, a makeshift workshop. Inside were fine tools, lengths of wire, and several unfinished raven components. His nest, Holmes said grimly. Holmes's deduction, our return journey along the river. Holmes was uncharacteristically animated, speaking quickly in short, precise bursts. Consider, Watson, the artificer's mind. His first raven was placed in a locked study, a puzzle to be solved. The second was a message to draw Pennington out. The third, in the warehouse, was the moment of execution. 3 movements like a symphony. What follows? A finale, I said. Precisely. A public finale. One designed not merely to kill, but to astound. He has already announced himself to me. Now he will attempt to humiliate me or strike at me directly. Where? Holmes's eyes took on that distant, glinting look I knew so well. London offers him many stages. Parliament, the opera, the railway stations. But Sabine is a clockmaker. His soul belongs to machinery and spectacle. There is one place above all others where he might stage his final act. I ventured a guess. St. Pancras. Holmes smiled faintly. You are learning, Watson. The clock tower of St. Pancras Station was, at that time, the pride of London's railway architecture. Its great clock face, visible for miles, dominated the skyline. Within, the tower's mechanisms ticked with the steady, monumental rhythm of Victorian engineering, a sound both comforting and faintly ominous. Like the heartbeat of the city itself. Holmes gained access to the tower that very night under the pretext of conducting a private security consultation. The station officials, well aware of the recent newspaper frenzy, complied readily. With lanterns in hand, we ascended the narrow iron staircase that wound its way toward the clocked chamber. The interior was vast and echoing. Brass gears the size of carriage wheels turned slowly in the lamplight. Chains and counterweights hung down like the entrails of some slumbering giant. The rhythmic tick-tock reverberated through the metal, so that one felt it in the chest rather than heard it with the ears. Holmes examined every beam, panel, and crevice with the tireless patience of a man reading a dangerous manuscript. At last, near the western face, he stopped. "Watson," he said quietly, pointing upward, There, suspended within the clockwork itself, cleverly tucked between girders, was the unmistakable shape of a raven. This one was larger still, its wings folded against its body, but its beak fitted with a complex assembly of gears and reeds. Holmes climbed the supporting ladder like a man possessed. He's built it here in the heart of London's timekeeper. The final raven. The timetable back at Baker Street in the early hours. Holmes spread out his notes across the table. He placed the mechanism here during renovations, 3 months ago, he said. He is not improvising. He has been composing this finale for half a year. The raven is wired to the clock's striking mechanism. When the tower strikes midnight in 3 days, the raven will sing and something will follow. Something. Holmes tapped the 3-pronged key. A lock, a trap, perhaps a detonation, perhaps a signal. Whatever it is, it will be public. It will be theatrical. And Sabine will be there to watch it unfold. Lestrade leaned forward, pale. We'll stake out the tower. Every entrance. We'll have men at every stair. Holmes shook his head. You will not fill the tower with policemen, Inspector. Sabine is cunning enough to sense a trap. We will let him believe his masterpiece will play undisturbed. And you? I asked quietly. Holmes's expression hardened. I will be there, alone, if necessary. At midnight, when the raven sings for the last time, a city holds its breath and so London entered a strange, tense vigil. The newspapers, fed carefully by Lestrade's office, reported that the raven killer remained at large, but contained. In truth, a net was being drawn around the clock tower of St. Pancras. Holmes spent those 3 days in intense preparation, studying blueprints of the tower, testing mechanical lockpicks, and rehearsing movements within the clocked chamber until he knew every inch of it in darkness. I sensed that the coming confrontation would be unlike any I had witnessed before. Sabine was no Moriarty, no mastermind of networks and schemes, but he was something perhaps more dangerous in its own way. A man whose genius expressed itself entirely through machines, whose cruelty was calculated to the tick of a guillotine as midnight. Of the third night approached, Holmes's trap, delicate, silent, and deadly, was ready. The raven's final song awaited. Chapter 11. The Midnight Confrontation. It was a bitter, wind-swept night when the appointed hour arrived. The fog that had blanketed London for weeks had finally thinned, but a hard, metallic cold settled over the city in its place. The stars were sharp and clear above the rooftops, and the lights of St. Pancras Station glimmered like watchful eyes against the blackness. Even at that late hour, the station was not entirely still. A few night trains hissed on distant platforms, porters moved with muffled steps, and the great clock face loomed like a solemn sentinel over the sleeping city. Holmes and I arrived separately. He insisted that I come by cab and enter the station as though on some ordinary business, while he disappeared into the shadows hours earlier, taking with him a small case of instruments and, significantly, the 3-pronged key. I did not see him again until I reached the narrow, iron staircase within the clock tower shortly before midnight. He was waiting there, half in darkness, his lean figure pressed against the wall, eyes glinting with controlled fire. He raised a finger to his lips. No sound, Watson. He will come. The tower at night. We ascended the spiral stairs in near silence. The wind howled faintly through the gaps in the tower's masonry, mingling with the low, solemn tick-tock of the great clockworks above. It was a sound that did not merely fill the ears but seemed to echo within the chest cavity, as though the very air were breathing in rhythm with the machine. At the final landing, we entered the clock chamber itself, a vast, echoing space of girders, beams, and gleaming brass. The great gears turned slowly, ponderously. Chains and counterweights creaked in their courses, and from somewhere above, a single raven gleamed dully in the lantern light. It was larger than any of the others we had found. Its wings, folded neatly against its sides, bore intricate etchings that caught the lamplight like lines of script. Its beak was fitted with twin brass reeds and a complex locking mechanism. Thin wires disappeared into the structure of the clock itself. Vanishing among the gears, Holmes approached it like a surgeon examining a patient on the operating table. He crouched beneath the mechanism and whispered, as I suspected, "It is connected to the strike train. When the hour strikes 12, the hammer that sounds the bell will also wind and release the raven. And when the raven sings, something within its breast will unlock." "Unlock what?" I breathed. Holmes gave me a sidelong glance. "That, my dear Watson, is precisely what I intend to discover before Sabine arrives." A trap within a trap, he took out the three-pronged key and inserted it carefully into the raven's base. The fit was perfect. As he turned it, the mechanism gave a low, resonant click, and a hidden panel in the raven's underside slid open. Within, nestled among gears and coiled springs, was a brass cylinder no larger than a man's fist. Holmes lifted it out with infinite delicacy. "Clockwork detonator," he murmured, "cleverly concealed." Sabine's grand finale would have been no simple spectacle. At the stroke of midnight, the raven would have sung its message, and this device connected to the bell mechanism would have shattered the tower. I felt a chill run through me. How large a blast! Enough to tear through these iron girders and send the clock face raining down on the platforms below, Holmes said grimly. Hundreds could have perished. The artificer wished to make his art immortal. He examined the detonator quickly, then set it aside on a wooden beam. "It is safe for now, but the man himself will not be far. His clock is wound. He will come to witness the moment." I looked around the chamber nervously. Shadows moved with every flicker of lantern light. There were countless places for a man to hide among the beams and stairways. The wind moaned through the upper apertures of the tower, mingling with the implacable ticking. Holmes extinguished our lantern and gestured for silence. The arrival,